Vladimir Putin is wanted through a warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. The International Court of Justice told Benjamin Netanyahu to stop expanding settlements in the West Bank. Yet none of them seems to care about what these international bodies say or do. In a global system in which leaders can pick and choose their international obligations, what is the point of having any rules at all? Good evening. My name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View. To any observer, the atrocities committed by Russian troops in Ukraine since February of 2022 are a clear violation of international law. ICC prosecutors had no doubts either, even though neither Ukraine nor Russia are under their jurisdiction. But since they have no legal means of putting Vladimir Putin on trial, the power of their ruling is purely symbolic. The same can be said of international court rulings on the war in Gaza and numerous resolutions issued by the United Nations, even those coming from the Security Council. Is the international legal order completely paralyzed and dysfunctional right now? We examine its current shape in this next report.
Few moments in recent global history have been met with the same enthusiasm that followed the publication of the Rome Statute. Signed in 1998, it laid the groundwork for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. Tasked with persecuting war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, it was meant to become a universal legal authority. But over a quarter century later, only 124 countries are party to the statute. 41 states, including major human rights violators like China, India, and Saudi Arabia, never signed the treaty. Others, such as the United States, Russia, and Israel, never ratified it. Washington withdrew its signature from the original document in 2002, claiming it was incompatible with the US Constitution. Then President George W. Bush even sought immunity from international court for American servicemen. Altogether, over 5.3 billion people live outside the jurisdiction of the ICC. United Nations resolutions are often met with similar lack of political gravity and seriousness. The organization has issued hundreds of such acts condemning Israel, including 15 in 2023 alone. Only 7 resolutions concerning other countries were passed that year. The UN has called on Israel to stop expanding settlements in the West Bank and to increasing humanitarian assistance to Palestinian refugees. But the government of Benjamin Netanyahu made it clear that it was never going to abide. And a growing number of states are following Israel's lead, making it clear that their own interests take priority over any international legal norms.
Much of our political reality has been shaped by the post-war rules-based international order. We know it to be significantly weaker than it used to be, but do any of its principles still apply? Well, to answer that question, I'm pleased to say I'm joined tonight by a panel of 3 expert guests. Joining us tonight are Graham Wood, senior reporter at The Atlantic, Manos Chavler, CEO of London Politica, and Victor Peskin, associate professor at Arizona State University. Good evening, gentlemen. And I want to begin with you, Victor, and ask perhaps a provocative but a very frank question. Given the context of the 2 ongoing wars in Gaza and Ukraine and the behavior of respective leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin, freely ignoring the decisions and actions of international legal bodies, what is the point of having an international criminal court or an international court of justice if their declarations and decisions are so easily bypassed?
Sure. Thank you for having me on today. It's a profoundly important question that affects the International Criminal Court and the previous UN war crimes tribunals for Cambodia, the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and so forth. So the problem, the challenge that today's international war crimes tribunals face that we see in the Israel situation and in the Ukraine situation is that despite the binding legal authority on states to hand over indicted suspects, states often have the power to defy these tribunals, and the tribunals, like the International Criminal Court, does not have any enforcement powers of its own to obtain the custody of suspects such as Vladimir Putin. So that puts the ICC in these two situations, and in all of its approximately 17 to 18 other country investigations, in real peril. So what happens is the tribunal needs to create allies among international human rights organizations, victim groups, and especially international and regional organizations and states. So states, third-party states, the United States, EU states, Poland, a range of states have a choice to make when it comes to the Israel-Palestinian situation and the war in Ukraine in regard to international justice. Are they going to come to the aid of international law and the rules-based order or not? So are they going to be surrogate enforcers to help enforce the rule of law and have trials at the International Criminal Court? Or are they going to come to the side, to the aid of states such as Russia or Israel or Sudan or Kenya and try to obstruct the tribunals? So what we're seeing in terms of the defiance of the Netanyahu government and the Putin government, and we've seen this with the Bashir government previously in Sudan, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, is that states will often try to defy tribunals and get their allies in the international system to do so. So even though these tribunals are quite weak politically, they still have managed to make incredible and a surprising gain. So if we recall the trial of Slobodan Milosevic, right? The trial of Charles Taylor, who was prosecuted by the Special Court for Sierra Leone. So these tribunals can and have in key situations obtained custody of suspects when political conditions change. So
I'm going to interrupt you right here, Victor, because you raised a very important point about the necessity to create allies, not just among states and international organizations. And on that note, I want to move to you, Graham, and ask about your experience on the ground, because you're an extremely seasoned reporter. You've reported from a range of different conflicts, including Ukraine and Gaza. What is the perception of the rules-based order on the ground in those places? Do people still believe that international institutions will come to their rescue?
Well, I'll start by saying that although I've been reporting on Israel and Gaza, I've not been able to go to Gaza, in part because of the obstruction of the Israel Defense Forces, which has made it very difficult for independent reporting to take place. But, you know, with respect to international law, there's always been this strange combination of naivete and optimism and cynicism on the ground regarding these institutions, because there have been, of course, people who think that international law will save the day, that it will deter bad action, that it will keep crimes from taking place. And in actual fact, of course, that typically has not happened. If you wait for international law to save you in the moment, then your salvation will probably take place post-mortem. So in Ukraine, in Israel and in Gaza, as in so many other places, there has been the hope, the ambition that international law will bring justice where justice has not been able to be found elsewhere. But of course, anybody who's been wised up to how international law actually plays out will be aware that there's a long time coming if that justice is going to come. And the actual dynamics that will cause conflict to stop, excuse me, are usually not because of international law, but because of old-fashioned politics, old-fashioned military dynamics, and international relations that take place quite apart from the institutions like the ICC and ICJ.
So let's talk about this metaphorical elsewhere. And on that note, I want to turn to you, Manas, because you consult both policy leaders and corporate executives. You travel the world quite frequently. What is the perception of the rules-based order in the places that were traditionally opposed to it, be it China, being the so-called global south, or whatever we actually define this part of the word? Do leaders in those places even notice the decline of the Western institutions? And frankly, do they care at all?
I think you've pointed to a really important trend. I think the idea of a rules-based international order was always, met with some degree of skepticism among countries of the global south, particularly in China, particularly in India and parts of Africa. But I think that, that trend has certainly deteriorated quite a bit in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In some sense, none of these countries in the global south ever truly, instinctually, inherently believed that the United States was the protector of international law, given that it hasn't even, in fact, ratified to the Rome Statute and the ICC, or for its own number of violations. You can think of the war in Iraq and starting in 2003, the occupation in Afghanistan, the invasion in Libya in 2012, as some of the many examples that exist out there. But certainly this war in Ukraine is a moment for countries in the global south to have to decide what side they're picking. Are they on the side of the US? Are they on the side of the rules-based international order? Will they sanction Russia? Will they veto resolutions against it in the Security Council? Or will they stand back? Will they choose to abstain on some of these resolutions, continue to do business with Russia, such as India has done, buying record quantities of oil and gas from Russia, and continue business as normal? So I think it is sort of a real defining moment. I think I'll finish off on one thing. There are a couple of things that make the Russian invasion in Ukraine very different from perhaps other Western incursions of the rules-based international order. There's three basic fundamental tenets to this, right? Number one, you do not invade a sovereign country and annex its territory. Russia's done that. Number two, you do not use civilians as an instrument in war. Russia has done that, which is why it has an arrest warrant out for Putin and one of his ministers. And number three, there's been a long-established norm that you do not use or threaten the use of nuclear weapons in wartime, and Russia's violated that too. And so in some sense, we're at some kind of a watershed moment where the rules-based international order is receding in trust as the underpinning idea of the global system, and different alternatives are being put forward, a kind of a Russian-led world, a Chinese-led world, or perhaps what many in the global south want, a multipolar world.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for providing context to the meaning of the very term rules-based order. We know what the West thinks of it. Now let's examine other perspectives. Much of the criticism of the ICC, the International Court of Justice, and even the United Nations revolves around the notion of neocolonialism. Countries of the so-called global south claim that these institutions serve imperial interests and deny justice to victims of crimes. Let's listen to some of these arguments in our next report.
As of 2024, the International Criminal Court has issued 49 arrest warrants. 10 people have been convicted, including war criminals and militia leaders. All of them, however, originated from African countries. Similarly, out of 6 special tribunals established by the United Nations, 5 concerned the global south. The only exception was the court examining crimes in the former Yugoslavia, which ceased its activities in 2017. No successful case or tribunal against any major superpower has ever been pursued. Many leaders and activists see this stark disproportion as evidence of neocolonial politics. Countries which once controlled Africa and Asia militarily are now perceived as imposing their own interpretation of justice. This tension cannot be overlooked because international courts rely on national authorities to apprehend suspects. Without a stable working relationship, the mission to put criminals on trials is doomed to fail. But many outside Europe don't see it that way. Since the ICC and ICJ are both located in The Hague, detainees are transferred to the Netherlands. This is often seen as a transfer of justice away from those who suffered at the hands of the accused. The proceedings are lengthy, taking years to complete. Sentences are rare and often considered too lenient, considering the severity of the crimes. Local judges complain that they're not able to take part in the trials. Considering all these shortcomings, it's no surprise that many in the Global South hold a skeptical view of the rules-based order.
Time will tell. As I said, the challenge is...
So, Graham, since you've been reporting for years now from different conflict zones all over the world, have you observed over the years a decline in the perception, not just of the West itself, but the United States in particular, as this standard bearer of international democratic principles that it used to once project, let's use that word, onto pretty much the entire planet? Has this changed on your watch?
Well, yes, I think with the rise of multipolarity, there's been a clear distinction between how the United States was seen before and how it is seen by large numbers now. I mean, there was always a kind of elite opinion that was very skeptical of the United States, was able to enumerate the numerous flaws in U.S. foreign policy and the ways that the U.S. has abrogated authority to itself. And the wider knowledge of these things is going to make people more skeptical of the United States. That said, it doesn't take very much travel at all to realize that people still understand the United States as a place they want to be on the side of. They want to travel there, they want to immigrate there, and they think of the system that the United States has for itself and wants for the world as an ideal that they would like to aspire to and repair, even if they can find flaws in the way that the United States has implemented that. So I think with the skepticism generally that has risen, you also have to notice what's been enduring, which is the belief that the United States has, in many ways, held up an ideal, and that ideal has to be shored up frequently against the United States' many foibles. But the ideal's there nonetheless, and recognized by many.
Victor, I want to turn to you and kind of follow up on what Graham was saying, because you worked, among other themes, also on Rwanda. And as we've heard in our report, it's a very frequent and a popular argument that many of the countries in Africa and Southeast Asia say the institutions based in Hague project a very specific Western-originated type of justice. They take away the justice from victims. They're an instrument of neocolonialism. Do you think there is some truth, some fairness to these arguments?
Sure. I think there is some fairness to the argument, but I would like to talk about how certain states use that neocolonial argument instrumentally.
You mean the states in Africa and Southeast Asia, like former colonial properties, right?
Exactly, right. So I grant that there is something to these critiques. I hope you can still hear me.
Sure.
But that it's important to understand where some of these tribunals and ICC investigations have come from. The government of Rwanda actually requested a UN tribunal. They ended up voting against it in the Security Council for certain reasons. But when it comes to the ICC, some of the same African leaders that lambast the ICC being neo-colonial actually went to the ICC to ask for ICC intervention. That happened in Uganda. That happened in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's happened in the Central African Republic. It's also happened in Cote d'Ivoire and Mali. So it's important also to see, and I'm not sure if we'll have enough time to discuss this, the ways in which certain African leaders have sought ICC intervention to have the court go after its enemies. Also, it's really important to understand that beginning in 2016, with the ICC's opening of the investigation in Georgia for the 2008 Russian invasion, the ICC, although the preponderance of arrest warrants are still on African suspects, almost half of its approximately 17 country investigations are now in countries outside of Africa. So it's important to look how the court and its last two prosecutors, the current one and the previous prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda of Gambia, have tried to go out of Africa and respond to the neo-colonial critique. The ICC is still a work in progress, but I think that with the focus on Israel, Palestine, and Russia, we see that there's an attempt to respond to the neo-colonial argument. And finally, the initial predominant focus on Africa can also, for African victims, be seen as a sign of the ICC's concern and care for the victimization of African victims.
So there is a change going on, and it's very important to be aware of this. And I want, on that note, to turn to you, Manas, and focus on another institution that we haven't spoken much about yet, which is the United Nations, and in particular the United Nations Security Council, that seems to be getting a lot of beating in international press these days. There seems to be a consensus that it needs reform, but there seems to be no consensus what kind of reform is needed. Do you think that there is a path to change the representation of the global balance of power to have it mirrored in the new institutional design of the United Nations?
I mean, I think what you're asking is the trillion-dollar question of the century, really, right? The United Nations Security Council is the only body of the United Nations that has actual enforcement power over the resolutions that it comes up with. It has 15 members. 5 of these are permanent members, 10 are rotating. And these 5 members are the 5 members, of course, that won World War II, plus the famous inclusion of China. But since then, in about the better part of 70 years or so, the actual membership of the P5, as it's famously known, has not changed. That's despite the fact that the world's largest democracy is in India. That's despite the fact that Africa doesn't have a single seat. South America doesn't have a single seat on the P5. And that's one of the reasons why any proclamations made by the UN Security Council ring a little bit hollow for countries in the global south. If you don't include countries in the process of decision-making, they're not going to be incentivized to actually follow the systems and rules that you espouse. As for if there is a pathway forward for reform, to be completely honest, I'm mostly pessimistic on this. If we're talking about technicalities, to actually change this fundamental inequality, to add a new member to the P5, say India, say Nigeria, say a country from South America, would require amending the UN Charter. Amending the UN Charter would require the explicit consent of all 5 existing P5 members. So it's a bit of a circular problem. And obviously none of the existing P5 members, or at least a significant amount of them, wouldn't want to, dilute their own power. And I think that's playing into the global trend we're seeing of what happens in the UN Security Council being made, less and less accepted by countries in the global south. And that comes in the face of particularly events in the last sort of year or two, where any resolutions condemning Israel's actions in Palestine are routinely vetoed by the United States and sometimes by its allies. I think a last thing that I'll say is that there might be some reason to believe that there are some elements of change coming, particularly with the United States as allies. In the United Kingdom, the new Labour government has dropped the UK's objection to the ICJ arrest warrant that might be sought for Benjamin Netanyahu and some of the ministers in his government for conducting crimes against humanity and war crimes in the ongoing war on Gaza. So there's a few small seeds of optimism.
We see that there's a change going on. Again, it's very important to be aware of this. I know it's a $1 trillion question. I don't think we actually have $1 trillion to award, even if we had an answer, but I'm afraid this is all we have time for tonight. Manas Shavla, Victor Peskin, and Graham Wood, thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Serious questions need to be asked about the future of the international rules-based order, because it faces serious problems now and serious challenges ahead. If institutions such as the United Nations Security Council continue without reforms, they will continue to lose relevance. It is an adapt or die moment for the entire system, and this much we know for sure. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next Thursday, we will examine the growing and very dangerous trend of state terrorism. So make sure you're with us also next Thursday. Have a good evening.